There's a saying that kids lie all the time. About homework, about brushing their teeth, about who really broke the TV remote. But when a 9-year-old boy looks a caseworker dead in the eye and says, "My mom chokes me. She wants to kill me," that's not a lie. That's a warning. And 10 months later, that warning turned into a murder scene. January 6, 2025, Detroit, Michigan. A landlord steps into the backyard of an abandoned home. Maybe he's just checking for leaks. Maybe he's planning renovations. Just another routine day, until he notices something strange. The ground, uneven. The dirt, freshly disturbed. And then something sticking out. At first, he probably thought it was nothing. A pile of old trash. Maybe a forgotten Halloween decoration. But as he stepped closer, as he brushed the dirt away, the horror revealed itself. Bound hands, bound feet, and beneath the cold January soil, the lifeless body of a child. That child was Zemar King. He was 9 years old. And the worst part? He saw it coming. Let's go back. 10 months before Zemar's body was unearthed, he sat down with Child Protective Services. This wasn't a case of a nosy neighbor making a vague complaint. This wasn't a misunderstanding about discipline. Zemar spoke. Clearly, he told CPS's mother, Brandee Katrice Pierce, regularly choked him, that she abused him, that she wanted him dead. I mean, if a kid tells you their parent is actively plotting their murder, you'd think that might raise some red flags, right? Maybe, I don't know, an emergency removal? Some kind of intervention? But nope. CPS, the very agency designed to protect children, took those chilling words and basically said, "Nah, seems fine." According to their official response, they found no preponderance of evidence of physical neglect. Let's break that down for a second. A 9-year-old describes being strangled, but CPS shrugs and says, "Yeah, we don't see any bruises, so good luck, kid." And then they close the case. They closed it. No emergency response. No follow-up. No accountability. Just 10 months of silence until the landlord found the grave. Now, let's piece together what really happened. Investigators believe Zemar was murdered in October 2024. His hands and feet bound. His body discarded like a piece of garbage. And his mother? She didn't report him missing. She didn't break down in tears and call the cops, screaming, "Someone took my baby." No, she packed her bags, grabbed her 3-year-old son, and left. By November, she was in Georgia, living her life, starting fresh, while her eldest child's body rotted in a shallow grave behind their former home. It took 2 months for someone to stumble upon Zemar's grave. 2 whole months where no one, not family, not neighbors, not authorities, noticed he was gone. And honestly, that might be the most haunting part of this entire case. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. How does a mother murder her child, bury him in a backyard, and just move states like nothing happened? And more importantly, why didn't anyone stop it? Because let's be real, CPS was warned. They had a direct report from the victim himself. Zemar told him his mother wanted him dead, and she delivered on that promise. So what went wrong? Was this sheer negligence? A broken system? A caseworker who just didn't feel like doing paperwork that day? Either way, a 9-year-old is dead, and the person responsible, the one he feared the most, was the one who was supposed to love him the most. Over the next few minutes, we're going to unravel this horrifying case piece by piece. Who was Brandee Pierce? How did investigators finally catch up to her? What charges is she facing? And will justice actually be served? But most importantly, how many more children are slipping through the cracks of the system, just like Zemar? Because this isn't just a crime story. This is a systemic failure. And if something doesn't change, Zemar won't be the last child to suffer this fate. So grab a seat. Stay with me. Because this case, it's only getting started. Every murder has a victim. Every headline has a name. But too often, when a child dies in a case like this, they become nothing more than a statistic. A brief, tragic footnote in a long history of failures. 9-year-old boy found dead. Child buried in backyard. Mother charged with murder. We hear the crime. We feel the shock. We move on. But before Zemar King was a victim, he was a boy, a real child with life, a personality, and dreams. And if anyone had bothered to listen, he might still be here. Let's step back before the horror, before the crime scene. Picture a little boy, big, expressive eyes, a wide smile, the kind of kid who could light up a room if given a chance. Zemar was just 9 years old, a kid who should have been worrying about math homework, recess, and whether his favorite cartoon was on TV, not whether his mother was going to kill him in his sleep. And yet, that's exactly what he feared. But let's not start with the fear. Let's start with who he was. He was smart, bright, curious, the kind of kid who asked a million questions because he wanted to understand the world. He was kind. His teacher said he was polite, always willing to help. He had dreams. Maybe he wanted to be a superhero, or a firefighter, or, who knows, maybe even the next great scientist, discovering things we can't even imagine. The truth is, we'll never know what Zemar could have been, because before he even had a chance to grow up, his story was already over. But here's the thing about kids. They're resilient. They find joy, even in the worst circumstances. And from the outside, maybe Zemar seemed like any other kid, but behind closed doors was a reality no child should ever face. His mother, Brandee Pierce, his own mother, was a monster in his story. And this wasn't a one-time thing. It wasn't an accident. This was years of torment, escalating like a ticking time bomb. Zemar knew he was in danger. He told people. And yet, somehow, every cry for help fell on deaf ears. I mean, imagine screaming, "Help! My mom is trying to kill me!" And the adults around you respond with, we'll check back in a few months. The real horror of this case? Zemar didn't just suffer. He suffered while knowing that no one was coming to save him. What if, just once, someone in power had said, "You know what? Maybe we should take this kid seriously." What if CPS had done more than just check a few boxes and call it a day? Would Zemar be alive? Would he be playing outside right now, laughing, scraping his knees, worrying about completely normal kid things? We'll never know, because all the what-ifs in the world won't bring him back. But someone needs to be held accountable, because Zemar King didn't have to die, and that's the real crime. Most horror stories start with a single warning, a shadow in the hallway, a whisper in the dark, a creaking door that wasn't open before. But real-life horror? It doesn't just knock once. It pounds on the door. It shouts for help. It begs to be stopped. And yet, somehow, no one listens. That's exactly what happened to Zemar King, a 9-year-old boy who tried to save himself. A child who spoke the truth, clear, direct, undeniable. "My mom chokes me. She wants to kill me." I don't know about you, but I call that a pretty big red flag. But apparently, Child Protective Services saw it as more of a gentle suggestion, because instead of saving Zemar, they ignored him. And 10 months later, he was dead. Let's rewind. When did the first warning signs appear? The truth is, they were always there. But the most chilling, the most damning, came 10 months before his murder, when Zemar made an official report to Child Protective Services. He told them, in plain, unmistakable words, that his mother, Brandee Pierce, was choking him, not spanking, not disciplining, choking. And it wasn't just once. He described it as regular abuse, a pattern, something that wasn't going to stop until eventually it killed him, which it did. Now, at this point, you'd think CPS would go into full panic mode, remove the child, conduct an in-depth investigation, maybe, just maybe, do their job. But nope. Instead, they reviewed the case and concluded no preponderance of evidence of physical neglect. We don't see any bruises. Kid's probably fine. No emergency intervention. No protective custody. No follow-up. Just a closed file. A death sentence disguised as paperwork. Now, here's where it gets even worse. Zemar's case? Not unique. This wasn't a one-time mistake, a single oversight in an otherwise functioning system. No, this happens all the time. Let's talk about some other children who cried out for help and were ignored. Get Gabriel Fernandez, an 8-year-old boy from California who was repeatedly tortured by his mother and her boyfriend. CPS received multiple reports. Nothing was done. He was murdered. Victoria Climby, a 9-year-old girl in London who was starved, beaten, and burned by her guardians. Social services were warned. They failed her. She died in agony. A.J. Freund, a 5-year-old boy from Illinois whose own parents beat him to death. He told a doctor he was being abused. CPS closed the case. Months later, he was dead. Let's break it down. CPS exists for one reason: to protect children from abuse. So, why does it seem like every other case ends with, well, we missed the signs? Are they underfunded, overworked, or just flat-out negligent? Or maybe they're using a magic 8-ball to make their decisions. Should we remove the child? Shake's ball. Outlook not so good. The truth is, CPS doesn't like removing kids from their homes unless they have clear evidence. And what counts as clear evidence? Apparently, not a child's own words. Not bruises. Not broken bones. Not a literal confession of impending murder. And the most horrifying part? Zemar knew they weren't going to help him. He tried. He fought. But in the end, he was still left alone with his abuser. And she made good on her promise. Now, let's fast forward to the final days of Zemar's life. CPS had come and gone. The file was closed. The door was shut. And behind that door, the real horror show was playing out. We don't know exactly what happened in the months leading up to his murder. But we do know this. He was still being abused. He was still in danger. And no one was coming to save him. Then, in October 2024, the abuse finally escalated to its inevitable end. Brandee Pierce, the mother who was supposed to protect him, killed her son. She tied his hands and feet. She buried him in a backyard. And then, she packed her bags, took her other child, and moved to Georgia like nothing happened. Because, fresh start. 2 months later, his body was found. Cold. Forgotten. The final, tragic proof that everything he said was true. This case raises the most chilling question of all. How many other children are out there, right now, begging for help, only to be ignored? Because Zemar wasn't the first, and he won't be the last. A house can hold 1,000 secrets. It can sit there, quiet, unassuming, just another piece of the neighborhood. But sometimes it hides something much darker. And for months, the house on that Detroit street kept its most horrifying secret buried just beneath the surface. October came and went. The leaves changed. The air got colder. Kids ran around in Halloween costumes. But behind the walls of that house, something sinister had already happened. Zemar King was gone. And here's the truly disturbing part. No one even noticed. No Amber Alerts. No missing person posters. No desperate news reports asking the public to help find a lost little boy. Just silence. Zemar had been wiped off the map. And the only person who knew the truth? His mother. And what did Brandee Pierce do next? Did she turn herself in? Did she show any sign of remorse? No, of course not. Instead, she packed her bags, took her other child, and skipped town like she was just moving on to the next chapter of her life. Because, apparently, murder is easier to clean up than a bad credit score. Investigators believe Zemar was killed in October, a full 3 months before his body was found. Now, we don't know exactly what happened in his final moments. But here's what we do know. When they found his body, his hands and feet were bound. He was buried in a shallow grave, behind the house, hidden, but not well. The home itself? Abandoned. Empty. A shell of a place where something horrific had happened. Now, think about that for a second. Why would his hands and feet be tied up? Did he try to run? Was he fighting back? Or was this something much worse? Here's where the case gets even more disturbing. Because we have to ask the question, was this a sudden act of violence? Or was Brandee Pierce planning this all along? Let's break it down. Theory 1, it was impulsive. Maybe it was one final burst of rage. Maybe she lost control, did something she couldn't take back. Maybe the moment it was over, she panicked, realizing she had crossed a line she could never erase. Sounds almost reasonable, right? Except for one thing. Theory 2, it was premeditated. Why tie his hands and feet? Why bury him so close to home, as if she didn't even expect to be caught? Why leave the entire city right after, starting over as if nothing had happened? I mean, sorry, but packing your bags right after your child goes missing doesn't exactly scream shocked and remorseful mother. But here's the truly chilling part. For 3 months, Zemar's body was there, buried, forgotten. People walked past that house. Cars drove down that street. And no one knew that, just beneath the dirt, a 9-year-old boy was waiting to be found. Then, in January, the secret finally came to light. Because the thing about buried truth, it never stays hidden forever. There's something unsettling about an abandoned house. It stands there, silent, forgotten, a relic of whatever lives once played out inside its walls. Most people walk past without a second thought. But sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. And on January 6th, in the backyard of a vacant home in Detroit, a nightmare clawed its way back into the light. The landlord had no idea what he was walking into that day. He wasn't there for anything sinister. He was just preparing the house for new tenants. A routine job, an ordinary afternoon, until it wasn't. Until he stepped into that backyard. The yard was overgrown, forgotten, neglected in a way that made it feel wrong. Trash littered the ground. Pieces of debris scattered from months of abandonment. And then something caught his eye. Something that didn't belong. At first, it just looked like a disturbed patch of dirt. Maybe an animal had dug something up. Maybe it was just the ground shifting with time. But then he noticed something else. A shape, a form, a small body. The realization hit, like a brick to the chest. This wasn't some forgotten piece of garbage. This wasn't just another abandoned house story. This was a crime scene. And buried beneath that thin layer of dirt was a 9-year-old child. Imagine for a moment being that landlord. 1 second, you're just checking a property. The next, you're staring at the remains of a child, hastily buried in a shallow grave, his hands and feet bound, his tiny frame left to decay. The landlord fumbled for his phone, dialed 911, and within minutes, sirens shattered the silence of that quiet street. The police arrived first, then the medical examiner, then crime scene investigators. One by one, they stepped into that backyard, each of them realizing, piece by piece, the horror they were about to uncover. Let's talk about what they saw. Because this wasn't just another case. This was something deeply disturbing. First, the body itself. Zemar King had been tied up, his hands and feet restrained. He had been hidden, but not well, as if his killer wanted to get rid of him, but not enough to actually leave no trace. The decay told him one thing immediately. This had happened months ago. But the most chilling part? The house. Because when investigators stepped inside, they weren't just looking at an abandoned home. They were walking through the last place Zemar King ever lived. Picture it. The door swings open. Dust coats the air. The rooms are empty, stripped of warmth, stripped of life. But beneath the stillness, something lingers. The echoes of a child's voice. The quiet, invisible marks of a life cut short. Maybe there were still a few of his things left behind. Maybe his fingerprints were still on the walls. Or maybe it was just an empty shell, a home that had already become a grave before anyone even realized. The officers stood there, taking it all in, and then the real work began. The investigators didn't just have a body. They had a mystery, a story that needed to be unraveled, moment by moment, detail by detail. Questions flooded the case immediately. Who had lived here last? Who was the last person to see Zemar alive? And most importantly, who buried him here? It didn't take long for one name to rise to the surface. Brandee Pierce. His mother. The woman who had packed her bags and moved across state lines. Because, nothing says, I totally didn't do it, like skipping town the moment your child disappears. When a mother loses her child, you expect grief, tears, a desperate search for answers. What you don't expect. For her to pack up, leave town, and act like nothing ever happened. But that's exactly what Brandee Katrice Pierce did. Because while her 9-year-old son lay bound and buried behind a house in Detroit, she was living in Georgia, hundreds of miles away, with no signs of remorse, no signs of fear, and absolutely no explanation for where her child had gone. Let's rewind a little. It's November 2023, a month after Zemar King's suspected murder. Detroit was starting to feel the bite of winter, the streets getting colder. And right in the middle of it all, without warning, without fanfare, Brandee Pierce vanished. One day, she was there. The next, she was gone. So, let's ask the obvious question. Why Georgia? Why did she pick up her life and move out of state? Right after her son was brutally murdered. Maybe she just needed a change of scenery. You know, new town, fresh start, fewer pesky questions about where her kid went. Or maybe she knew what was coming, and she was running. And here's the truly chilling part. What did Brandee do in those months after her son was gone? Did she grieve? Did she spiral into despair? No, she just moved on, like nothing ever happened. Authorities started connecting the dots quickly. A dead child, a mother who skipped town. It wasn't exactly subtle. Not the best cover-up strategy. Brandee, if you're gonna vanish, at least pretend to be surprised when the cops show up. Detroit police launched a manhunt, working with out-of-state agencies to track her down. They traced her to Georgia, watching and waiting for the perfect moment. And then, they made their move. So, how does a mother-turned-murder suspect react when the past finally catches up to her? Well, Brandee had two options. 1, run. 2, surrender. She chose neither. When officers finally caught up with her, it wasn't a dramatic foot chase through the streets. No car chases. No desperate escapes. She was arrested quietly, because where was she going to go? She had already tried to just leave town and hope nobody notices strategy. That didn't exactly work out. After the arrest, Georgia authorities wasted no time. They prepared to send Brandee Pierce back to Michigan, back to face the consequences of what she had done. Her quiet escape was over. The lies, the running, the silence, none of it mattered anymore. Because now, she had to answer for Zemar King. 4 months, Brandee Pierce ran from the truth. Now, the truth was coming for her. And it wasn't coming softly. See, the thing about the legal system is, when you do something this horrific, when you bury your own child in a backyard like he was trash, when you try to disappear like nothing happened, they don't just slap you on the wrist. They throw the entire book at you. And in Brandee Pierce's case, that book was thick. First-degree murder. The most serious charge in the state of Michigan. This isn't just accidental death. This isn't heat of the moment. This is planned, intentional, cold-blooded. If convicted, there's only one sentence for this. Life in prison. No parole. No second chances. Felony murder. In simpler terms, committing another felony while also committing a murder. In this case, child abuse leading to death. Which brings us to child abuse. And not just any child abuse. The severe kind. The kind where CPS was warned. Where Zemar himself said, "My mom wants to kill me." But hey, apparently, that wasn't concerning enough at the time. Tampering with evidence, which, let's be real, is just a fancy way of saying she tried to cover it up. Concealing a death. And what a horrific way to conceal it. She didn't call for help. She didn't report her son missing. She didn't even pretend to look for him. She buried him. Like he was nothing. Now let's talk strategy. Because Brandee has lawyers, and they're gonna try something. Will they claim she wasn't in her right mind? Maybe they'll say she snapped? Or will they blame it on someone else? It wouldn't be the first time a guilty person tried to dodge responsibility. But here's the thing. The evidence is overwhelming. CPS reports? Check. A child who literally said, "She's trying to kill me," months before he was murdered? Check. A body found tied up in the backyard? Check. A mother who disappeared the second she thought nobody was looking? Big. Fat. Check. Legal experts say this case is strong. Too strong. There's no mysterious suspect. There's no missing pieces. It all points to Brandee Pierce. So what's the end game here? Well, Brandee has two options. 1. Go to trial and fight the charges. 2. Take a plea deal to avoid life in prison. But here's the catch. The first-degree murder charge, it carries life without parole. So unless prosecutors reduce the charges, which, let's be honest, seems unlikely, Brandee is looking at a life behind bars. And when that prison door slams shut, when she's left alone with nothing but her own thoughts, will she finally feel regret? Or was she always as cold? Some stories stay with you, not because they're thrilling, not because they're shocking, but because they shouldn't have happened. Because somewhere in the middle of all the tragedy, all the horror, there was a chance, just one chance, to stop it, and no one took it. Zemar King was 9 years old. 9. Old enough to know fear. Old enough to beg for help. Old enough to say the words, "My mom wants to kill me." And yet, somehow, some way, that wasn't enough. What would have been enough? Child Protective Services. It's supposed to be the safety net, the last line of defense between children like Zemar and whatever nightmare waits them at home. And yet, how often does that net break? How many times do we have to see this exact same story play out before we admit that something is deeply, horrifyingly wrong? Because Zemar's case, it isn't rare. Let's take a walk down a very, very grim memory lane. Gabriel Fernandez, age 8, tortured, starved, and murdered by his mother and her boyfriend after CPS had been called multiple times. AJ Freund, age 5, beaten to death by his parents after 17 reports of abuse when ignored. Victoria Martins, age 10, brutally murdered in her own home, despite CPS being warned about the danger she was in. These kids? They all had stories that sound just like Zemar's. They asked for help. They trusted the system. And the system failed them. So I have to ask, if CPS isn't protecting kids like Zemar, Gabriel, AJ, and Victoria, then who exactly are they protecting? Now, let's be clear, Brandee Pierce is guilty. No question about that. She murdered her son. She buried him in the backyard like he was nothing. She ran to another state, thinking no one would ever find out. She deserves every bit of justice that's coming for her. But is she the only one who should be held accountable? What about the caseworkers who ignored what Zemar told them? The ones who read the words, "My mom wants to kill me," and decided what? That he was exaggerating? That he was lying? That it wasn't urgent enough? What about the policies that allowed this to happen? What about every single person who had a chance to intervene, but didn't? Because let's be honest, Zemar King didn't have to die. He warned the world. The world just didn't listen. At what point do we say enough? At what point do we stop treating stories like Zemar's as just another tragic headline and start treating them as a call to action? Because right now, there's another child out there, just like Zemar, scared, alone, begging for help. Will someone listen this time? Or are we just waiting for the next story to break? He was a child with a name, a laugh, a life, dreams, fears, favorite foods, bad days, good days. And when he was terrified, when he begged for help, no one came. But now we hear him. And if there's any justice left in this world, we won't ignore the next Zemar. If you're angry, good, you should be. Because this is more than just one case. This is about a broken system that lets children die when it should be saving them. So if you ever hear a child cry for help, listen. If you ever see CPS fail to act, speak up. Because the next time this happens, it could be another Zemar. And that is one time too many.